Response video to LudditeReturns. Yeah, really an obnoxious video. Declaring victory, blah blah blah, we win, our philosophy rules, kind of nonsense. And okay, in the context of a very aggressive, snarky video using Photoshop laugh tracks. So yeah, that's not really the definition of a winner. Winners don't resort to that. Winners sit back and maybe have a smoke and kind of enjoy it. They don't sit there and resort to this kind of celebration. This looks a little bit desperate, like you're desperately losing and therefore have to resort to send in the clowns as a response. So anyway, so the first half of 2 minutes or 3 minutes of his video is just awful. And so anyway, he gets to a little rant in here that's kind of nice because it's nice and quick, and he hits a lot of subjects and hits them with just this preposterous misdescription of the subject entirely. So it's all straw man and all nonsense. So anyway, let's go through it.
Empirical evidence for causal determinism is regularity, to his brain cell destroying contentions on the philosophy of mind, maintaining the survival relative advantageous nature of consciousness while maintaining to, quote, consciousness doesn't do anything, to philosophy of ethics.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, so he just says it like, okay, like that's just nonsense, right? The fact that consciousness doesn't do anything. But it's the fact, okay? The fact is you can't find your consciousness. I can't see my consciousness construct this sentence. The whole framing of my argument that I'll make and how I'll compose this argument against what you're saying, I have but the vaguest notion of its likely direction. Its composition is entirely taking place in some other part of my brain than the part that's conscious. And that's just a fact. Maybe that's not true for you. Maybe you consciously construct your sentences. I do not. And it just seems clear that the programs have a heritage and an origin and an understanding that's much deeper than my conscious understanding, because they are able to be very articulate and sometimes come up with things that literally surprise my consciousness, meaning that they had to work on this in secret. My brain had to be working on it without my knowledge for it to be able to construct some of the complex ideas that come out just as sentences like they were any other sentence. So yeah, you're not making a counter argument, you're just doing the typical, I'm pretending you're not having that conversation because I don't have a response to it. And the fact is you don't have a rational response to it. The fact is you don't do anything consciously, you do everything as a construct of the mechanism and function of your brain, not your identity.
Maintaining descriptions in themselves contain transperspectively moral normativity.
I don't know what that has to do with determinism, but anyway, so he threw the word determinism here too. It's just a throwaway word, as if somehow having a controlled consciousness, one that's controlled by your life experience, by learning things. The fact that you can't fly to the moon, right? Human beings didn't just fly to the moon one day and say, okay, we just flew the moon. No, they had to learn how to fly to the moon. And that's the requirement. You're required to be educated, you're required to be exposed, you're required to acquire knowledge. These are the requirements of life. There is no special forces that pop the knowledge into you. There's just the ideas. You're exposed to them and they compete with each other inside your subconscious, and something wins, and that is who you become. And your demeanor from day to day can change by just subtle sentences. Somebody can say the right thing to you. You can have a good day or a bad day. The cat dies, and we're going to have one kind of day. The cat doesn't die. You have a different kind of day. That's the way we live our lives, and it doesn't mean anything regarding whether or not we do a bad or a good thing. It doesn't mean anything whether our fundamental programming is reasonable and rational or whether it's fundamentally selfish and evil. And that's really the difference. There's no distinction except the distinction of whether or not you compromise what you knew to be the right thing by the fact that you knew you would profit more from doing the wrong thing. And it's just those balances of equations, and you make the judgment that somehow there's advantage to the immediacy of your satisfaction and not advantage to doing the right thing.
To his flittering between negative utilitarianism and talk of individuals possessing the right to expression of ontological autonomy. For example, the argument can readily be made on negative utilitarian grounds that individuals have absolutely no right to die, where their death would actualize more suffering than their continued existence.
Well, again, so this is where he just takes an argument to some preposterous extreme, and so he puts people in categories, calls them hedonists, which means, you know, that they only value this some sort of negative or positive thing. And again, he uses the word utilitarian without putting the word negative utilitarian in front of it to emphasize the fact that there is more value placed on the negative experience than any positive gain experience. And certainly it is understandable in the condition that we exist in that words like consent mean something. They're not irrelevant to an equation. So if you're taking from something else to get what you want, is very different than you taking from yourself. So if you're going to risk your own self by doing some kind of thing like bungee jumping, that's okay. But if you're going to risk somebody else's welfare, it's not. And obviously the condition of life is not one that somebody volunteers for. So always, and I think absolutely, they should have a right to say, I have not deliberately invested in this game, and I have every right to get up from the table and walk out, no matter what it does to you. Because you had no right to put me here in the first place. You had no right to put me in the chair and say, you will play by our rules. They don't have any obligation to give any care to your rules, because your rules violated their rights right from the start.
If person X would prevent 10,000 suffering units via his suicide, but would cause 15,000 suffering units.
Oh, see, so again, he's using suffering units as nobody. He's pretty much talking directly to me. I've never talked about these units. I've never said there are such things as these units. What I've said is there's a basic functional value to these experiences, and I've never stated that you have some possession, so well, I mean, he's again trying to do math. Let me just replay it. So I want to make sure I'm sort of lost.
1,000 suffering units via his suicide, but would cause 15,000 suffering units in loved ones. Quite clearly, on negative utilitarian grounds, person X has no right to die. To his continued recycling of the hedonic asymmetry, to briefly summarize,
right. So again, he's saying that somebody has obligation to a game they didn't voluntarily play, but I would argue that the argument goes even deeper than that. And this is probably a good place to pause. I'll pause here because I know I have the argument, and I'm waiting for my brain to come up with it, and it's just not there. So I'll wait till I have it. All right, I think I got it. So part of it would be like the slavery argument, right? You could argue under utilitarianism that it's appropriate to have slavery because it maximizes productivity. So it does in fact cause, yes, damage to the person who's a slave, but you gain so much productivity through that activity that it's worth it. A similar argument could be made about torture, that torture does in fact work, or even law enforcement. You could argue that if you have draconian penalties for all violations of law, like a death penalty for jaywalking, that you have to impose very little punishment because people will be so afraid to ever commit the crime. And so in theory, it might be very productive because you prevent the crime very easily. You don't have to prosecute too many cases. You don't have to have an extensive justice system because the penalty is so draconian. Everybody will be scared to death to go anywhere near crossing that line. Now the argument would be made that that's what utilitarians are saying must be, and that's not the argument at all. Okay, because they understand the fact that there is more value in the negative being imposed than there is value in the positive to be gained. And that's the real argument, and that, because you have created a circumstance where this is necessary in the first place, you're the one that has to resolve the problem through something of your own you give, rather than taking it from somebody else. So you can't just pick a victim and say, I'm going to throw them in. Like, it's back to the argument of, utilitarianism in the sense that if you're going on some joyride, you can't justify it. So you can only justify it as a compensation for a negative that has to exist, not a negative that doesn't need to exist. So if the negative that's existing, that you're saying you're going to treat by torturing somebody, it's your obligation to demonstrate that the negative you're preventing wasn't preventable in the first place. That there was some good cause that it exists for. And the argument would be made is that there is no good cause to justify the negative that you're saying another negative compensates for. Long way of saying is torture is bad, and utilitarians know that.
Ridiculous claim that hedonic value states can never be that of benefit.
So again, he keeps using this word hedonic, even though negative utilitarians keep saying they have no value. They place very little value, very small value, on any of these gratifications, because these gratifications are all eccentricities, they're all extravagances essentially. They're silly ways to satisfy perceptual needs. People need to think the human race will exist. Now, it's not a need that's real, it's a need only that exists in their head. They can't rationally explain why the need is real. They can't show it in the real world. They can only say, I think it. So it's only exists inside their brains. And so it's just like some you could have two rats. One rat can live on 50 calories a day. The other rat needs 400 calories a day. The obvious equation would be, well, rat A is much more efficient, 50 calories versus 400. The same is true of our economy in the sense that some people need Lamborghinis and, polish this and shiny that, and where other people can be just as happy or comfortable on much less, and that's just a fact. So there is efficiency built into our function, and you can't justify grotesque inefficiency, and you certainly can't justify imposing suffering on a minority of individuals for something that can be considered extravagant or delusional or perceptual. Your needs are not real. They are your extravagant contrivances of your deluded psychology.
Where benefit is a state intrinsically more value positive than an indifferent or neutral state of affairs. This has been demonstrated to be contingent on a massive manure pile of falsities and ad hoc unfalsifiable contentions over and over
and yeah, whatever. That's an unuseful argument, okay? There's nothing there. You're just saying, no, it is not. That's all you just said, You didn't respond to the argument at all. You didn't explain how it's unreasonable or how you somehow have some legitimate purpose or function that you are now entitled to impose on somebody else. You've not shown me your I'm a worthy God card.
And over again, and Mintam still continues. He's like William Lane Craig, breeded with the fucking Energizer Bunny. Desire is not synonymous with deprivation, where deprivation is...
Well, desire, yes it is. It's the primary function of hunger is deprivation. Desire and hunger are almost synonymous words. They're almost interchangeable words. So to have a hunger is to have a deprivation. You need something. You're incomplete without it. You're not satisfied without it. And there's a thing. So desire is really just a word of saying you have a dissatisfaction that has a locatable key that fits. The piece of puzzle fits the emptiness, where there can be other hungers that are more ambiguous and you don't even know where to look to find any gratification or satisfaction of them. But anyway, so a desire, though, is kind of a focused hunger.
Is a negative hedonic state. Desire satiation can actualize a hedonic sum positive, as experientially evidenced. There is no...
Okay, hedonic sum positive. So he's claiming that there's a positive in satisfying a condition that didn't need to exist in the first place. So he's basically saying you can create need and then satisfy the need, and that's productive. And I would argue that there's no demonstration that that's productive beyond the addict saying so. So that's like a heroin addict saying, I'm living a productive life because I have deprivation, then I satisfy my deprivation, and therefore this cycle of need dependency is something you should respect. most people can figure out that it's not respectable, that it just ends up doing damage in the end, and that it's a silly chasing of one's tail kind of thing that will inevitably just end up wearing you down until you're dead. I mean, you're not going anywhere. It's not going to accomplish anything, and it always comes at a cost, a social cost, like with the heroin addict, but like all human desires come at social costs. You kill people for your shiny diamonds. You abuse people in all kinds of ways to have what you call your comforts. You don't live in a heated house or anything else without people dying in coal mines or other people being blown up at a refinery. There's a price for all of it. None of it's free. And all of it is a need that never needed to exist. They're all satisfying needs that you didn't need to create.
Correlative necessity such that experientially positive states are reciprocally mirrored by negative states, and hedonic positive states.
So again, he's just saying that I'm saying it's worth it. Me going to the carnival is worth shoving somebody in the trunk who's going to be sick and hate it. So I can torture somebody to gain my gratification at the carnival, and that's acceptable. He's saying it's okay to cause negative experiences because other people's negative experiences are justified by the value created by my happiness. So me satisfying a silly need to go to a carnival to gain some ego gratification, like I had fun, I played games, somehow you can justify these negative that's going to be imposed on some minority for you to gain that gratification. And I would argue that there's no such equation. It's not rational. It's only selfish. And that's the only way it can be seen as acceptable is through selfishness. If you knew the child that was going to be paralyzed for you to play football or to win the Heisman Trophy, if you had to shake hands with all the little children that got paralyzed in Pee-wee football, would you still want your Heisman Trophy? Would you still say, oh, what a great guy I am? I think rationally you wouldn't if that context was imposed on you. But it's only because we separate ourselves from those contexts that we can play the game and pretend it's all okay. It's because we don't see the people dead in the coal mine that we can enjoy the comfort of our heat. It's because we don't see the 10-year-old kid who gets his arm lopped off by a combine that we can enjoy our bread. It's because we don't see the price that we say the price is okay.
Are not of necessity conditional on hedonic negative states. To his fucking...
Well, he's saying they're not conditional, and I mean, it's just silly to say. I don't think there's any gratification you can gain from the world or take from the world without there being a value exchange, in the sense that you will deprive somebody else of the... Like you take a banana, somebody else can't have that banana, quite obviously, and they have to settle for something else, and maybe the something else is quite disgusting and awful, and maybe they'll die. If you drink all the good water and there's only shitty water left over, that's the real world equation. There's no free lunch. There's nothing to be derived from the world that you can derive it freely. I mean, nothing is a practical matter. I'm not saying you can't have some sort of simple life and live independent of too much exploitation, because you certainly can. But that's always a complicated circumstance, right? It's very hard to just go into the woods naked and survive. And then if you did do that, the miseries and deprivations you would experience would be substantial. And you wouldn't like that. And the only thing that makes life worth living is the fact that you can move that deprivation and that pain and suffering onto some unknown minority of people who will in fact have to live without their arm because it got lopped off in a combine. I mean, that's the only thing that makes it worthwhile to have what we have, is that we can take the same pain and suffering that it's made out of. We can take the work and effort and labor that generated it and move it someplace else where we don't have to see it.
Laughable charge that procreators are playing God.
Okay, so you think it's laughable, but you're not going to make any counter argument. A god is known by the very fact of creation. Every god I've ever heard of was a creator, all right? And so it is God playing fundamentally. You're taking the greatest power and authority there is to take, essentially. There's, killing somebody and giving birth to somebody. These are the things, right? And I'm certainly going to argue that creating life probably has more implication than taking a life. Because obviously taking a life, depending on how far advanced the life is, you can only take half of it away. And I would argue that in all likelihood that life is probably too expensive anyway. That life is too high a price. We all exist at the cost of a biosphere where zillions and zillions of animals die horribly every day. I mean, this is all little happy pictures, right? It's all little. They don't show the maggots eating in through the eyeball and chewing up their brains and them spinning in circles while the lions rip their flesh off. That's the reality. Every single day, the biosphere pays this huge price to provide us oxygen to breathe and an environment to live in. And you don't seem to want to account for any of that.
Same anachronistic charge that religious fundamentalists make regarding stem cell research and genetic modification to his...
Well, whatever. You want to keep comparing it to a religion when it's exactly the opposite of a religion. Go ahead, but I'm just going to keep saying that just points to your credibility, right? It's an incredible accusation to call a philosophy that denies the existence of the creation and denies the separation of the human from the biosphere and from the natural process as something worthy, or something as a pinnacle organism of deliberate creation. I mean, it's quite obviously quite the opposite philosophy. And the argument is not one of dogmatic argument. It's an argument based on psychology and the fact that we can tell the difference between a rat that needs 50 calories to be happy and a rat that needs 400 calories to be happy. We can see the obvious efficiency difference.
Talk of procreation as imposition, while cotemporally denying moral agent responsibility.
Well, no one's denying moral agent responsibility. So again, determinism does not change the fact that you're an asshole. Okay, the fact that a rabid dog is not malicious in its rabies, the fact that it has no volition, it has no intent, doesn't change the fact that it's a rabid dog and that you have to shoot it or cage it or do something horrible to it because it's a menace. And human beings can still be a menace, they can still be assholes, they can still be called broken, they can still be called a shitty computer that doesn't work right, even though it's deterministic, right? If I get a computer and it sucks, right, the CPU's burned out and it doesn't work right and it does its math wrong and it fucks up, the fact that it's deterministic doesn't change the fact that it's broken. It doesn't work well. And I would sit there and take the CPU out, or I'd buy a new one, I'd throw it in the garbage. And the same truth exists for human beings. The fact that you're an asshole doesn't make you, because of determinism, doesn't undo the fact that you're an asshole. It doesn't make you non-asshole if you're an asshole. If you're broken and stupid and ignorant, you're still all of those things, whether there's determinism or not.
I would be odd indeed to speak of a falling rock as imposing pain on person X, having landed on person X's head. And
so again, now he's using determinism to argue that somehow because we're determinism that we can't have conversation, and conversation is somehow irrelevant, and there is no changing our rock structure through conversation. And quite obviously the argument being made by people like me is that I have some perception that you're a little more intelligent than a rock, and that if I draw you a picture, explain something to you, unlike a rock, you will change your shape. Okay, the rock can't understand the words, it can't understand the vocabulary, it can't change its shape, it can't fall differently. You, on the other hand, can change your shape if words affect you and change the patterns that run inside your brain. And so the obvious rational argument being made through these words is that yes, this whole medium of communication makes it possible for us to change each other's structure, to create arguments that are persuasive and compelling, and to change the way you behave. So now you're not a rock that just falls on somebody's head like an asshole. You can now prevent yourself from being an asshole, because the you inside of you, the programs running, will now run right instead of wrong. It's like we can fix the CPU, we can fix flaws in the software by just sending a little bit of a viral bit of code, and that little bit of code will fix the flaws in your perception. And the flaw in your perception is your preposterous ego and your sense that you have some entitlement, because nature gave you sperm and a penis, that you have some entitlement to go shoot that gun any old place you want to. And the fact is, you don't have any intrinsic right, okay, and that there is a huge consequence to that use. And so, of course, that determinism. Understanding is determinism. It requires me to speak words for you to hear the words, for you to change. It requires you watching a movie. The movie has to be made. The message has to be sent. You get the message. You change your behavior. That's the way it works. It's all determinism. But let's not pretend it doesn't have an impact and it doesn't change us. It's changing us every single day. Alright, well anyway, I have to eat my dinner, so I shall be back. Leave us continue. So just this context, and let's just remember that the argument being made here is that this is all just perception of need. So it's much like the non-existence of the Martians. The Martians don't exist. We, as intelligent sentient creatures, do not lament their non-existence. We don't recognize it even. We don't even contemplate it. We don't spend any time whatsoever at all concerned that some sort of potentially magnificent sentient creature does not exist on Mars. It doesn't disturb us in any way. Likewise, we are in no way compelled to be concerned with the Martians' welfare. There's no, just in case the Martians were in conflict or having wars or doing something bad, and we'd have to go over there and fix it and intervene, and it would be a terrible pain in the ass. And let's say the Martians were much like humans. Would you really want something like humans living next door, coming to visit, moving in literally next door? The Martians moved in next door, and they were pretty much just like humans. Yeah, I don't think you would. I think you'd say, gee, we're better off without those bastards. They just dirty up the place. And so it's all just perception. And it's all based on some human-centric, human ego manifestation where you just can't imagine the world functioning, the universe functioning without you. But just like the universe functions without the Martians, or the Plutonians, or the Venetians, or the Mercuryites, or the Moonikins, or the whatever zillion other little planets you can come up with, the universe would function just fine without humans, without any risk of anyone being imposed upon, by anybody being tortured so you could play a game that doesn't need to be played. Obviously, the need doesn't need to be created. The need doesn't need to be created. And it only opens the door to risk and danger. Alright, let's continue.
According to Gary, procreators are no more responsible for the actualization of a given state of affairs than the falling rock.
And so again, he's assuming that I'm saying procreators are dumb as rocks. And quite literally, they are ignorant and foolish, stupid. They are, in fact, assholes. But the truth is, they do have a brain, one assumes. Yeah, I assume. And that they can be communicated with, and they can potentially understand that what they're doing is obnoxiously aggressive. They are throwing gambling dice with somebody else's welfare. They can't control the experiment, and if things go wrong, they won't be able to fix it. There is no undo button. And there's absolutely no reason to be that obnoxiously arrogant when you're not God.
But procreators are conscious, sentient, Gary says. But Gary has already stated that consciousness is causally inert. But we have brains, rocks don't. Notice Gary's injection of dualism between self and brain when he references my brain, or we, a term denoting interpersonal univocal identity, or our psychology, the very same dualism that Gary decries. But per Gary's...
Yeah, well, I'm not going to argue the fact that our language is full of stupid words. It is, in fact, my brain. It is this consciousness's brain that produces what we call Gary, the personality. And that's a fact. All right, now how you want to explicitly identify that whatever, that functionality, so it doesn't matter. But the point is, it does exist as a brain. The point is that there is an impact of this swirl of knowledge, and that one would hope there would be a linear projection of knowledge in the direction of obtaining understanding. And it would be my clear argument that to glorify psychology is to do the opposite of achieving understanding. It is the road to delusion, not the road to enlightenment.
Just as a rock landed on a person's head, just is non-teleological process Y, actualizing a state. A procreator procreating, just is non-teleological process Y, actualizing a state.
Right, and they are actualizing a stupid, ignorant, arrogant, obnoxious imposition state, an imposition state of being, an asshole state of being. And clearly it would be expected that if it was explained to them that they are behaving like an arrogant asshole, an obnoxious, presumptuous impositioner, that they could recognize that that is in fact the truth, that they are making huge, gigantic assumptions, that they are investing somebody else's welfare in their silly preferences and what their silly expectations that the beastie they are going to create will have the same likes and dislikes as they will have. It is a silly presumption, a silly assumption, and they should logically be able to recognize that. The logic is not complicated. You have no right to assume that the thing you're creating is going to have your same tolerance for eating shit.
My misery in me makes my point for me, and we shall see he's either really dumb or he's being willfully dishonest. He says, parents impose unnecessary suffering on children through procreation. Who or what imposes? Parents impose. While at the same time making the following claim, to quote, the brain does everything, there are no persons who act. So,
again, so you want to play games with words, you can go ahead and do that. Obviously, the existence of person in the sense of you being a machine, like a computer, acting, does exist. The fact that you are some kind of thing beyond that, beyond a reaction, beyond a reacting mechanism, is the argument. Yes, you're nothing more than a reacting mechanism, and when you procreate and qualify yourself as a parent, you are now responsible for what you produce. You're a machine that replicates. If my computer could make a copy of itself and it produced a copy, it would now be in a new category as a replicator. So it can or cannot. We have the choice based on our programming, based on the logic we've accepted or rejected. We have the choice to turn that button on or turn that button off, turn that switch on or turn that switch off. And clearly the argument being made is the only thing that could possibly turn the switch on would be this obnoxious, arrogant, impositioning, egomaniacal, insane piece of shit. And the only rational thing to do is do the fail-safe, non-dangerous, no possibility of loss choice of leaving it the fuck alone.
my misery in me's own admission There are no parents who impose, as there are no persons who act.
Well, whatever. I mean, this is just silly word games. That's obviously a straw man argument. That's not his argument. He is not claiming you don't exist. He's claiming that the concept of you having a you inside of you is bullshit. What you have is ideas, programs, principles, and you either are a logical, reasonable, sensible machine, or you're a fucktarded, moronic, egomaniacal, selfish psychology that's just using intelligence as a scheming mechanism to get what you want, and you don't care about the truth. So you're either a fucking asshole, a broken piece of shit computer, or you're a good logic device that appropriately processes the facts and draws the rational conclusions. Those are the two positions your brain can become. And what distinguishes one position, what will decide what position you will be how pervious your brain is to logic. If somebody speaks logic to you, or draws you a picture of it, or shows you a movie of it, or shows you some other representation of it, you will either understand the concept of playing God, or you'll mock it and pretend it doesn't exist. And that'll be based on how pervious you are to logic, how reasonable you are as a thinking device. If you're unreasonable, you'll just mock the idea and say, ah, ha, ha, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Or if you're reasonable, your brain is pervious to logic, you'll realize, I don't have the authority to play God. If I'm actually doing something that looks like God playing, then maybe somebody should critique that and explain it to me, because that's a very dangerous thing for a non-God to be doing. An incompetent should not be playing God, and there's absolutely no evidence that humans are competent, that they can control the experiment, that they can prevent the harm, and that they can undo the harm. So they can't do any of those things, so this is not a game they can play safely, and therefore they shouldn't play it. Just like they shouldn't build nuclear power plants that aren't sufficiently fail-safe. If they can't make it sufficiently fail-safe, they have no right to impose the danger on the environment or the people that will be subjected to the potential destruction of their life. Gee, not complicated, asshole. So anyway, the rest of his video is probably shit, so this is enough. He's made 2 more slop videos. One of them whining because people point out that life on Earth has been created through zillions and zillions and zillions times the speed of light squared processing experiments. Animals have been tormented and tortured essentially through this horrid mutation process to achieve the glory of our silly, eccentric, imbecilic gameplaying. And that although that price, there's no undo button, there's no way to fix what has been paid, and there's no reason to think that that would be our obligation to somehow pay it. It is a fact of our existence, and we should be cognizant that past would tell a reasonable mind. A reasonable mind would say from the past that you should learn from it, and that you certainly shouldn't be perpetuating any mistakes that are built into that structure. And that if it was done wrong in the past, and very wrong and very wasteful, that maybe you have an obligation to do better in the future. And if you can't guarantee that, or produce some expectation that that's where you're heading, then you have no right, again, to play the game. So whatever, fuck you, turd. You're obnoxious. I mean, let's just point out that he has in this video images of other people where he plays laugh tracks over them. So he's resorted to essentially Photoshop and laugh tracks to make his arguments, which in my estimation is evidence of defeat, not victory. Yeah. So anyway, because they're so funny, how do they justify their awful videos? And this is not an example of an awful video. No, I think you're the one who needs to justify yourself. Sorry, buddy. Way too short. Yeah. I mean, really, you just make me more confident. I mean, you're not putting any dents in my confidence in my position when you resort to lies and straw men and misparaphrases and plain mockery. I mean, that's really not going to be persuasive because I am, in fact, a reasonable person, not like you, an unreasonable whore, you know, for wishful and delusional thinking. So, till next time. And such. Oh, okay. An old Mendham picture. Anyway, till next time.